Some of the darkest Soviet cases were not hidden because nobody knew about them. They were hidden because the state decided the public should not study them too closely. That matters even now. If you want to understand fear in the USSR, you have to look not only at what happened, but at what people were prevented from fully knowing. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. The Soviet Union did not treat information as a neutral public good. It treated information as part of state power. Britannica notes that Glavlite, established in 1922, had final authority over printed material and the performing arts. That meant newspapers, books, and public discussion could be filtered long before ordinary citizens ever saw them. So when a case threatened the moral image of socialism, revealed state violence, exposed a disaster, or contradicted official ideology, it could be delayed, narrowed, or buried altogether. That is what this video is really about. Not just dark cases, but dark cases the Soviet public was never meant to examine openly. Some of them were political crimes. Some were mass tragedies. Some were criminal investigations distorted by ideology. But they all reveal the same thing. In the USSR, public understanding was often treated as something to manage, not something to respect. One of the clearest examples is Katyn. Britannica describes the Katyn massacre as the mass execution of Polish military officers by the Soviet Union during World War II. The core facts now are not seriously in doubt. Soviet responsibility was officially acknowledged only decades later, and in 1992, documents released by the Russian government showed Politburo and NKVD responsibility for both the massacre and the cover-up. But for years, the Soviet public lived under a completely different story. The state blamed Nazi Germany and defended that version long after the war. So Katyn was not only a massacre. It was also a lesson in how official truth could be manufactured and maintained across generations. What makes Katyn especially important is not just the crime itself, but the shape of the denial. This was not a small local case hidden in provincial silence. It was a major geopolitical lie, tied to diplomacy, war memory, and state legitimacy. If the Soviet public had studied Katyn honestly, it would have had to confront a devastating fact. The state was capable not only of mass killing, but of building an entire public fiction around it. That is exactly the kind of truth the Soviet information system was designed to keep out of open civic understanding. A second major case is the Novocherkassk massacre of 1962. According to the Soviet History Archive, workers in the city protested worsening economic conditions. Troops opened fire, and 24 people were killed. The same source notes that authorities tried hard to cover up what had happened, that information leaked back into the USSR through Radio Liberty, and that the first Soviet newspaper article devoted to the event did not appear until June 1988. That means a major act of lethal violence against Soviet citizens remained effectively outside legal Soviet print culture for more than a quarter century. This case matters because it reveals another category of forbidden study, violence that directly contradicted the official identity of the state. The Soviet Union claimed to rule in the name of workers. Novocherkassk exposed workers being shot by that very state. A case like that could not be openly taught, studied, and discussed without damaging the political mythology that held the system together. So instead of becoming a public lesson in justice, responsibility, and reform, it became a buried event, known privately, whispered about unevenly, and only much later admitted in print. Then there is the Kishtim disaster of 1957 near the secret Mayak nuclear complex. Britannica states that a buried tank of radioactive waste exploded after cooling failure, contaminating about 23,000 square kilometers, forcing the evacuation of more than 10,000 people, and probably causing hundreds of deaths. It also states that the Soviet Union denied the disaster until 1989. This was not a murder case in the conventional sense, but it was absolutely one of the darkest cases the Soviet public was never meant to study. It involved death, environmental contamination, delayed evacuation, and the militarized secrecy of the atomic system. Kishtum is especially revealing because it shows how secrecy can deepen tragedy. A closed information system did not simply hide embarrassment after the event. It shaped what people could know while danger was still unfolding. In a transparent system, a disaster on that scale would force open public discussion, scrutiny, and long-term accounting. In the Soviet system, it was absorbed into silence. That meant not just fewer headlines, but less public understanding of risk, responsibility, and human cost. The public was not meant to study Kishtim, because studying it honestly would have required studying the state's own negligence and concealment. A different, but equally revealing case is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica notes that his case is important, not only because of the large number of victims, but because police efforts to warn the public were hampered by official ideology, which asserted that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. That sentence explains a great deal about late Soviet silence. The problem was not that no one suspected a pattern. The problem was that publicly acknowledging the pattern was ideologically uncomfortable. If a serial killer was operating, then the official image of Soviet social order was under pressure. That made Chikatilo's case one of the darkest examples of a truth the Soviet public was not meant to study clearly while it was happening. People disappeared. Fear spread. Police increasingly understood they were facing a repeat offender. But the public was not informed with the directness the situation demanded. A society can only protect itself against a danger it is allowed to name. In this case, ideology stood between public reality and public warning. That is not merely an investigative flaw. It is a structural problem in how truth was managed. What links these cases is not simply secrecy, but the logic behind secrecy. Cotton was hidden because it exposed state murder. Novocherkassk was hidden because it exposed the state firing on workers. Kishtim was hidden because it exposed a catastrophic disaster inside the strategic nuclear system. Chikatilo's case was constrained because it exposed a form of violent criminality the Soviet worldview did not want to admit. Different cases, different periods, different victims, but the same governing instinct. If the truth damaged the state's image, the public was not supposed to study it freely. And that shaped public psychology in a profound way. In an open society, dark cases can at least become common reference points. People argue about them, study them, and incorporate them into a shared understanding of risk and history. In the Soviet Union, many of the most important cases were instead half-known. Citizens sensed there was more beneath the surface, but the legal press, official institutions, and ideological language denied them the tools to think about it clearly. As a result, rumor, private memory, foreign broadcasts, and later archival revelations had to do the work that public institutions should have done much earlier. That is why these cases still matter now. They are not only dark stories from the past, they are examples of what happens when a state decides that public study itself is dangerous. Once that happens, truth stops being a shared civic resource and becomes a guarded object. And when the darkest cases are the ones the public is least allowed to understand, a society does not become calmer or safer. It becomes more vulnerable, less informed, and more dependent on fear mixed with uncertainty. In the end, the darkest cases the Soviet public was never meant to study tell us something larger than the details of any single file. They show how power works when it fears its own reflection. A massacre, a workers' shooting, a nuclear disaster, and a serial murder investigation all became harder for the public to study for the same basic reason. Honest knowledge threatened the state more than silence did. And once you understand that, Soviet darkness no longer looks like isolated tragedy. It looks like a system. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.